talking to a really good friend recently, had a conversation that was distressingly similar to a lot of conversations I've had in the last few years. This is a woman who I look at and see as a total success as a person. She has navigated a complex life and complex world in an elegant way, an intelligent way. But she was saying of her own life that she felt like it was a failure and that somehow it didn't make sense to her, it had no shape that she recognized. And that she felt a kind of disconnect with what she had expected and what she saw. And because I come from a background that's both literature in part and graphic design in part, I started thinking about this in terms of it being a kind of a fictional crisis, or a crisis in fiction in a way. What do I mean by that? I mean essentially that there's this imaginary, fictional standard about the shape of her life that she was comparing her real life to and finding her real life wanting. And what really is disturbing to me, kind of heartbreaking to me about that, is that I always tend to side with the human being in any given situation and not with the outside imaginary standards. And it got me really thinking about how, what a powerful influence literature and story has on culture. I think of examples like Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, which arguably kind of single-handedly creates the Romantic movement in the late 18th and beginning of the 19th century, or novels like On the Road, which kind of created a whole generation of a certain type of wanderer and seeker in American culture. And thinking about not only the semantic content of it, the story part of it, but also the physical form, and that's where my graphic design part comes in. I began to wonder if there is a problem with the form of fiction, and if there might be a formal solution, a solution in terms of physical form, in an activity that I've been involved in for a number of decades, electronic literature, the kind of translation into new forms of the literary tradition, into electronic forms. So my question as I started to think about it was, does life resemble a book, or does it more resemble a smartphone? Well, first of all, I have no problem. I don't think there's any kind of problem with writing. I love writing. Writing is a strange, magical technique, and I'm particularly fond of our kind of Phoenician alphabetical system. To me, there is a basic fundamental trick about writing, a basic gesture which still amazes and amuses me, and that is that writing makes an inanimate object speak, even though we all know that the only creatures capable of language at our level are human beings. And to me, I kind of summarize this by the epigraph that I want carved on my headstone. So far from being an age, I believe, that where writing is deteriorating as a practice, I think we're in an age that could be described as one of the great golden ages of writing. Why would I say this? Well, if you, again, look at literary history, you look at ages like the Elizabethan age, when writing was very important, and particularly important kind of in everyday love lives of people. I look at us as being a culture now where we're writing constantly, and we write in different forms and formats than we used to, but just like in the Elizabethan age, the content of our love lives is often carried in written messages, and probably you've got some in your pocket right now on various devices. So we just know from cultural history and literary history that any time when lots of people are writing about things that they care about intimately, when they're writing from the heart, that most of it is going to be not terribly interesting off into the future, but a certain small percentage of the top skilled people is going to be fabulous. And I'm predicting very confidently that in centuries to come, people will be reading work that's being done electronically, writing that's being done electronically right this very minute. Nor am I particularly worried about fiction itself, the basic gesture of fiction again, is to take forms that are generally used for telling the truth and to lie in them, to falsify them. And so the origins of the novel as we know it, kind of what I'm thinking of as the novel, that the influence of which carries down to our century from the 19th century, where it kind of got congealed into a particular form, is to say, oh, I found this stack of letters, and I know they're kind of saucy, I take no responsibility for that, but I just present them to you as a kind of a typical forward to a novel in the 18th century and early 19th century. Or, so it'd be a fake biography, a fake history, other kinds of fakes, or what we might call them mockumentaries now is a good term. It's sort of a term that we're familiar with, of refreshing that fictional gesture. So I really think the problem lies in the fact that a particular kind of storytelling, a particular kind of novel, the 19th century novel, what once was flippantly but rather accurately referred to as rich white people's love problems, is what a novel is, a 19th century novel, got kind of onto a single track where a certain kind of shape, a certain way of dealing with characters, a certain shape of the story, and despite kind of variations in what happens to the individual characters, got locked into a formula. And I think that it's that formula, which is built to talk about the mid-19th century, that's got... Oh. So, anyway. So the question really becomes, what do we mean by a book? And with my graphic design hat again on, I look at four categories, or four characteristics of the trade paperback novel, which of the 19th century tradition, which we find in our bookstores now. And it has these characteristics. Basically, physically, it's a neat rectangle. And as designers, we know to never take for granted that first impression. But that's important, I believe, the fact that it is a very nice, neat rectangle. The Codex book that we're familiar with has pages bound on one side, they're in a fixed order, and the text actually stays the same from moment to moment, from day to day on those pages. But again, we seem to take that for granted, but it's worth noting. Typography, uniform typography, pages full of typography. And remember that this is not for any aesthetic or communication design reasons, simply economic. Type was expensive to make, and so uniform paper was expensive, so you had tightly packed type all of the same size. And the book, as the structure of the communication, is a one-way communication device. So when we look at these categories, what I'm thinking about these days, the ideas that I'm exploring, are that in a sense that single rectangular object kind of resembles, in a sense, the human body, and puts forward a sort of communication by analogy that the story is neatly contained and completely contained and whole within the book, so a life should be whole and complete within that body and kind of consistent. What we know about 21st century reality, of course, is that we all have multiple lives. We're multiple people. If you think of who you are at the Thanksgiving table compared to who you are 2 in the morning with your best friends, that's the beginning of an example, but we know all the statistics about how many careers people are going to have, not just jobs, but how many different careers, how many relationships on average statistically people are likely to have, and you see that we are all multiple people. This unchanging text order is a hugely powerful symbol in Western culture. It implies, it's sort of an implicit guarantee that this book was put together in the right order with a great design, it's often thought. And I see that as being analogous to the sense that life should have a steady progress from beginning to end and kind of have this predictable path. Whereas we know, just from experience, even young people will know, that life tends to be surprising and wandering. And the students who I work with, you know, when you ask university students what they will be doing, or even what career path they'll be on in 5 years, few know. It's the way things are. But that's this really interesting moment. It's something that 100, 150, 200 years ago would have been a source of huge anxiety for people. One of my favorite aspects, I put to you that neatly ordered typography in the typical book is a kind of visual symbol of an orderliness of mind that we assume that the writer had. And that the writer, we assume that writers were good spellers and they wrote, thought in complete sentences, and that a book, if you have enough coffee and stamina, you can read it all the way through and that there's a steady voice there. But we know from literary biography, of course, that writers write in all different kinds of moods, high and low, and that one of my favorite examples, look at the Hemingway manuscript. He's an absolutely terrible speller. He'd never make it through freshman comp. So all these kinds of realities even of the 19th century author are belied by this form. And in fact, we know from our own inner experience that we are, from moment to moment, different people. And we have, from moment to moment, we have different parts of our brains firing, as the new brain science is showing us. And it's not at all that consistent look. And the one-way communication tends to have one simple message. Author big, you small. Author smart, you dumb. Author speak, you listen. Whereas we live in a world now where communication in multiple directions is very common, and we may sort of inherit that cultural sense of authority of the author, but our everyday practice is already doing something quite different. So, what does electronic literature have to offer? And what about the technology part of it? People often, when I talk to, often say, well, isn't there a difference between the book and then, book versus technology? And there's a kind of a cultural image that we have of technology, and this is usually a male person, way old enough to know better, who all of a sudden is spending all of his time hunched over the glow of this new technology, never going outside, ruining his eyes, and having his head filled with sort of dungeons, dragons, and damsels. And you'll recognize, of course, that I'm talking about Don Quixote. For those of you who haven't read wonderful, wonderful novel, first published in 1605, Don Quixote is about the archetypal video game nerd. He's a guy, the book begins with a kind of intervention of his friends and neighbors trying to tear him away, get those knights in armor fantasies out of his head, and free him from the thrall of technology. So it's worth remembering that the book itself is a technology, and that almost all the warnings about technology that we hear about contemporary technology have already been made centuries ago about that technology. They're also part of our cultural tradition. So electronic literature opens up a world of multiple glowing rectangles where people are writing on all the kinds of screens that we have around us, but writing in a fictional way. Some of the projects that I've done in my own career over the years have been novel and email. Have done sort of fake chat rooms, several fake websites or home pages, and it's interesting to me now that in one of the things I see very currently is that there's beginning to be a sense in the culture as it's used that the minimum for a reader, user of technology is 2 screens. And how many people watch TV and also read their cell phone? And the NFL just pioneered a thing this last fall where in certain stadia where you sit and watch the game, but watch your own custom replays on a little device. So it's kind of odd to me to imagine paying that ticket price and then you go to look at a screen. But that idea of multiple screens is really growing. And to me, that physical form, that graphic form of multiple screens much more approaches the reality of our multiple selves and multiple lives. The text, far from being bound and fixed, either on the page or in order, is now hyperlinked and it's updatable, which means that friends of mine write stories where the text changes as you're reading, where every time you go back to a certain page, the text is in a different order. And that seems to me to correspond much better to that wandering life. And in particular, the typographic choices. All of a sudden, interesting typography, expressive typography, is not limited by cost. And we have imagery, and it calls to mind, it makes us watch out for the sense of, that picture books are not real books, that a real book has that dense old Puritan typography, and that somehow imagery will sort of lead you astray. It's either for kids or it's for entertainment, but it's not serious. And I object strenuously, looking at the history of the book. If you really know the history of the book, which was often beautiful to look at, object that objection. And I think that this new era of typography corresponds much better to the shape of our internal experience. And then now we also have, instead of one-way communication, we commonly have three-way communication, which is to say writer to reader in the old sense, reader back to writer, quickly and immediately and in the same typography, in the same format, and then, very interestingly, reader to reader. So is life more like a book or like a smartphone and other screens? I'm thinking that it really is more like a smartphone. And I am calling to my colleagues both in the literature community and the graphic design community to join forces and to do things like, I mean, the thing that I always ask, the place that I start, for all communication, especially just even straight ahead scholarly communications, who says that all we get to play with typographically is regular italic, bold, and bold italic? That those are handcuffs that are from days gone by that we no longer have to submit to. So I really encourage people to band together using the full range of visual expression, the full range of storytelling, and, verbal expression, and to create new works. I'm working on a piece now called Grace, Wit, and Charm, which is going to premiere in May, and create works of art that don't make people feel bad. Thanks.